Happy Friday, everybody. It's the Friday you've all been waiting for. We are finally going to talk about European formula, which has got to be one of the most popular questions I get. And I've been putting it off because it's a very complicated answer. So we are going to get started talking about it today. I'm doing happy hour early, so I'm not drinking quite yet. Our family has recently been ravaged by the stomach flu, which is just ripping through Chicago, apparently. So I am officially solely maintaining my body weight by getting disgustingly ill roughly once a quarter. So I'm looking very svelte right now. I told my husband, like, oh, Dave, look how skinny I am. When I was so sick the other day, he was like, well, you are. You also look horribly green, so back to bed. Anyway, now I'm recovered and I get to enjoy being skinny for a hot 2 days before I pack it all back on. I'm looking forward to doing that. Okay, but back to the issue. European formula. Also, both boys are napping and I'm here alone, so I hope they don't wake up. Just cross your fingers for me. I just published an article with a lot of this information and numbers on my website. So if you want to have more of a print copy of everything I'm going to talk about, maybe to share with your doctor, just go to babyformulaexpert.com/European-formula. And I'll add that to the comments when this video is posted. But I know watching things is way easier than reading when you've got a baby, so let's get through it. So today I'm going to be talking about all the things that you really need to know and consider when you are considering the European formula and then which one. And then next week I'll get into a detailed review of your main options. It's just way too much to do in one day. Because today I'm also going to talk about things like differences in regulations, but also things that you need to look out for a supplier, if you're going to be buying from the US. Okay, I've been wanting to do this for a really long time because there's a lot of pro-European sites on the internet, a lot of mommy blogger sites that, are pro-European formula, which is great. But in my experience, and I don't mean this to be insulting to anybody, but in my experience, they're really lacking in useful information. A lot of different sites are like, European formula is very different. It comes in a box instead of a can. The language is different. Like, these are all true, but they're not this. Those aren't the things that you need to be considering. It's just like the formula review sites that say, when choosing a formula, just decide, do you want powdered or do you want liquid or do you want concentrate? Like, okay, yeah, you do need to decide that, but the ingredients are way more important than those, which is why I started my site. So I'm going to be focusing today on what I think are the most important things, such as the regulatory differences, the ingredient differences, and how to be sure your baby is getting appropriate nutrition if you buy from another country. So let's get started. I've got how many main points? 7 main points to cover, which is why we're going to do the breakdown of brands next week. So the first main point is that farming is a big difference between American sourced farms that are used to source formula ingredients and European. One, the big thing is that all European formulas have to be organic. That kind of sneaks into the regulation, but it's like organic plus. Because we do have organic formulas here in the US and they're great, but they're kind of even more severe in their regulation in Europe because the European Commission, which is kind of like their equivalent of the FDA, requires that there be quote unquote no detectable pesticide in formula. So in the US, you can have a certified organic farm that's doing appropriate organic practices, but it could be next door to a farm that uses pesticides and a little bit like flies over. And no detectable is really, they measure this to the tiniest concentration. So that means that farms that source European formula ingredients have really high standards. They can't be anywhere near more commercial farms, and they can't use any pesticides in any level of the processing. So in the food that's fed to the cows, in any of the lactose that's sourced from the milk. It's pretty intense. Also, a lot of the formulas choose to pursue an even higher certification, which is called Demeter farming. It's a German word, so maybe it's Demeter. Terrible of me there. I pronounce it Demeter. I hope that's correct. It's basically a biodynamic farm. But what this means is that the cows, because I care about how happy the cows are, the cows are grass-fed, but the whole farm kind of functions as its own sustainable biosphere. So, they eat food that's grown there. Their own manure can be used for fertilization. It's a very sustainable way, but that ensures that the cows are also pastured, so they graze. All these things make for cows that don't get sick. They can't have antibiotics anyway, but they're less likely to have things like inflammatory cytokines in their milk because they are going to be less inflamed themselves. So I think that is an amazing pro that Europe has pursued in some of their formulas that the US is a little behind on. Also, less important nutrition-wise, but is important to a lot of families, a lot of European formulas have pursued sustainability criteria. So like I said, a Demeter farm is sustainable and biodynamic in nature. A lot of other companies have a carbon neutral certification, so they source all sustainable ingredients and leave no carbon footprint. This is also particularly relevant to palm oil, which is a very common ingredient in formula and is usually farmed in a very unsustainable manner that can contribute to global warming and rainforestation. And so a lot of European formulas choose to source all their ingredients from sustainable sources. So like I said, that doesn't necessarily contribute to the ingredient quality, which is where my expertise is, but it is important to a lot of families. And so it's something that you can get in a European formula that is really hard to come by in a US formula. So that was the first thing. We've got different farming certifications. And basically the EU just pursues more stringent criteria. Second, goat milk is like a legit thing in Europe. By that, I mean in the US, the FDA hasn't officially approved an infant goat milk formula. That doesn't mean that they don't think it's appropriate. It just takes a lot of paperwork for a company to go through the process. It's well approved in Europe. So you've got two big companies, Nanny Care and Hala, that have a full-blown goat milk infant formula on the market. And there's regulations for it by the European Commission. And so it's very easily available. I'm not going to go through the goat milk options today because, again, that's a whole nother topic. But when you go to, like in the US, you're like, well, do you want cow's milk or soy? There, it's cow's milk, goat milk, or soy. It's a big option. So that's the second difference. That's a quickie. 3, maybe I should have put this one first because this is the biggest difference between European and US formula. European formulas use a stage system. This is not to be confused with the marketing stages that some US companies have come out with, which is why I'm so kind of against it. In Europe, they have officially terms. There's infant formula and then there's follow-on formula. Infant formula is for babies 0 to 4 to 6 months. So the stage when baby is only consuming liquid, either breast milk or formula. Then once baby's getting a significant amount of solid foods, so good nutrition from solid foods, that's follow-on formula. So from like that 4 to 6 month time up to a year. So follow-on formula sounds kind of like people get confused with like a toddler formula in the US. No, it's still in that first 12 month, that infant period, but it's regulated differently. They have different nutrient criteria for one versus the other. How it gets confusing is those terms aren't regulated in the US. Like I know Happy Baby and Munchkin have their stage 1 and 2, and their stage 2 is like a toddler formula. Gerber has stage 1 and 2, and they try to market it like a European formula where stage 2 is 6 to 12 months, but you can also use stage 1 all the way to 12 months. Like all that stuff is not regulated terms in the US, so the companies can just do whatever they want. But that's a really big deal. Like if you have an 8-month-old baby and you want to use a European formula, it's really important that you use the stage 2 because their nutrients are specifically matched for a larger, bigger baby who's also getting some nutrition from solid foods. And I'll talk more about iron later and give you an example of that's probably the most important nutrient that differs. So the stage thing is huge. And very regulated there. And so every single formula company has a stage 1 and a stage 2. Whereas in the US, it's like, anything goes. And the differences, I'll say the differences in the stages are bigger in Europe because they have different, sets of criteria for each. Whereas in the US, it's really, in my opinion, the differences are so small. It's just mostly marketing, like newborn versus infant, that kind of a thing. Usually it just ends up as a way to get you to spend a little more money. Okay. And then Europe also has stages 3 and up. Stages 3 and 4 are more like our toddler formulas. So that's for when baby's out of the infancy stage. So I'll really only be focusing on stage 1 and 2. Okay. Next is the biggest. Let's focus on the regulation, the differences in regulation between American and European formulas, because this is what you want to know. I'll also say this is what most doctors don't know. I mean, most people don't know. This is not your doctor's fault, but why some doctors are uncomfortable with the European formula, because they don't know, and God, they don't have time to go read European regulations. Apparently I do. So I have read the actual regulatory documents. So this is my interpretation, but I didn't read any blogs. I just went to the European Commission website and read the I thought it was fascinating, but very boring, long legal documents about the regulations. This is my takeaway about the biggest differences between how the FDA regulates formula and how the European Commission regulates formula. One, which we already covered, is the pesticide issue. No formulas can have any detectable limit of pesticide. This means that by nature, all formulas that are marketed in the EU are organic, or, kind of fit in that category, which a lot of parents want, and I'm a parent, I don't blame them, I do too. So, and that's one of the biggest draws. Any formula that you get in the European Union is going to be organic. Okay, next. This kind of fits into the stage issue I was talking about with different nutrient requirements. The biggest nutrients that differ between stage 1 and stage 2, and also between US, really between US and European, you know where I'm going, is iron. And it's big. So I'm going to throw some numbers at you. Basically, the summary is that Europeans think we put way too much iron in our formula, and we think they put way too little. So I'm going to aside say there are brilliant, well-respected scientists, both at the FDA and the European Commission. So this is a very nerdy academic debate. Clearly, it's not a black and white issue. But here are the numbers. For the FDA, so for American formulas, remember we don't have stages, so any formula for babies 0 to 12 months has to contain between 0.15 and 3.3 milligrams per 100 calories of iron. That's a really big range. In the EU, the European Commission, again, has differences for these 2 stages. For stage 1, tiny babies, 0.3 to 1.3 milligrams. So that's like their maximum is a third of what our maximum is for their tiniest babies. Once babies are 6 months, the range jumps a little from 0.6 to 1.7. So just to recap, the maximum amount of iron allowed in a European formula is either 1.3 for stage 1 or 1.7 for stage 2 milligram per 100 calories. For reference, for example, Enfamil newborn and all of Enfamil's formulas have 1.8 milligrams per 100 kcal. Gerber's stage 1 and stage 2 is 1.5 for stage 1, 2.0 for stage 2, and all of Similac formulas are 1.9 milligrams per 100 kcals. So all of our formulas, really any formula that you can get any standard formula that you can get in the US exceeds the maximum allowed amount of iron set for formulas in the EU. This kind of goes twofold. One, that's a lot of iron. And I know the FDA and the AAP all say there's no reason there's tons of studies that iron doesn't cause constipation and babies don't react poorly to it. Well, I have come across a few babies myself that definitely seem to not do well with so much iron. I agree, it's rare. Alternatively, European formulas err on the side of extreme caution. So I've talked about this before. If you are about 9 months and your baby's finger prick came back that your baby's anemic and you've been exclusively breastfeeding and the doctor suggests adding some formula, well, European formula might not be the best choice because it's really not that much iron. So it's not a fantastic way. It's not like an iron supplement, which our formulas basically are. So that's the biggest difference is in the iron. It also shows you kind of how they split their ranges for stage 1 versus stage 2. And usually that's how it goes. You'll see a little bit higher limits for certain vitamins and minerals for the stage 2, which makes sense because you've got an older baby who has, more body mass. So iron is a big one, and that is the biggest micronutrient difference between formulas. 2, The biggest macronutrient difference is in the carbohydrate or the sugar. And I hadn't read these regulatory documents before, and I felt so validated reading them that, I can't find a lot of people talking about sugar or sucrose in formula, which digests to be 50% fructose. And I am just got to be in my bonnet about this. And apparently all of Europe agrees with me, so I'm not the first one to bring this up. But they actually set regulatory limits on sugar in formula, which the US does not. We actually don't set any limits on the type of carbohydrate at all. It's just a set grams. So the appropriate amount of calories is coming from a carbohydrate source. And then it's left for the companies to decide. So in Europe, they set limits. Listen to this. No intact protein formula, which most formulas are, same in the US, can have any sugar or sucrose, like table sugar. None. I was like, holy moly, that's awesome. I'm looking at you, Similac Organic. If we were in the US, violates that rule, but it's not a rule here. Furthermore, partially hydrolyzed formulas or partially hydrolyzed, formulas in the EU can have no more than 20% of their carbohydrate from sucrose, which some of our partially hydrolyzed formulas here are over that from sucrose. So they would have to provide if you don't use sucrose, you have to use a glucose-based carbohydrate like corn sugar, maltodextrin, glucose syrup solids, or of course lactose, which is the default carbohydrate. And then for all formulas, there has to be a minimum of 30% lactose. That includes soy formulas as well. So that's really different from the European or from the US market. For example, all the soy formulas in the US are lactose free, 0 lactose. That's a really big difference if you switch, say, from a soy formula in the US to a soy formula in Europe. That's a really, really big change for your baby to jump from 0 to 30% lactose because, it requires a special enzyme to digest lactose. So it could be a big shock to their system. Furthermore, a lot of our sensitive formulas have way less than 30% lactose. So like just off the top of my head, let's see, Baby's Only Lacto Relief, which is a toddler formula, Gentilese, Similac Sensitive, Earth's Best Sensitive, all of those have less than 30% lactose. So those formulas would be like illegal in Europe. They wouldn't be allowed. So I hope this is triggering your mind. If you're on one of these formulas, switching to a European formula, while it may be a more intense organic regulation, you could be looking at a really big ingredient change for your baby. Okay, so sugar, that's a really big difference, sugar and iron. The other differences in the regulations are in sort of the extras or those small ingredients that come after the less than 2% on the label. So one is the additives that are allowed in formula, and people, I see so much like formula's so full of junk and additives. I mean, formula companies don't just add additives to be mean, because formula's got to have a very specific taste and texture for baby to swallow without either, gagging or like coughing it down their esophagus, down their airway. So that's why some of these things are added. So it's not to be mean, but the European Union has decided that to be more conservative on some of these preservatives and texture ingredients. For example, they don't allow any guar gum or any of the other gums that you see. And the other big one is no carrageenan. It's relatively common to find carrageenan in ready-to-feed formulas in the US. And again, carrageenan is one of those things that adds that sort of creamy texture. So, and that creamy texture is important, but they use other sources in the EU. Other very small differences, L-carnitine is required for all stage 1 partially hydrolyzed formulas there. It's not required here, although some companies do add it. Inositol is required in all formulas here because all formulas are 0 to 12 months, whereas it's only required in stage 1 in Europe. So usually stage 2 doesn't have any. I think that's a minor. I personally agree with that once a baby's having solid foods, they don't need any inositol anymore. But you don't get to make that choice in the US because we just have one infant formula designation out to 12 months. The other interesting extras thing you see isn't really a regulation, but just seems to be something that companies take a stance on differently there versus here. So here we often find that companies add nucleotides, taurine and some lycopene and lutein as these, like, I call them kind of sexy extras that are things that are found in breast milk that companies add often to formula in the US to try to make their formula more like breast milk. Well, in Europe, they take a different stance. They don't add any of that stuff. I haven't found a single formula with nucleotides in it in Europe. But they do often add single amino acids, particularly, I wrote them down, phenylalanine, tryptophan, and tyrosine. Honestly, I can't tell you why. It's all, I always think of it as all well-intentioned. So that's how they're trying to make their formula look more like breast milk. None of those things are required by either the European Commission or the FDA, but those are very distinct, I would call, cultural differences. So again, if you get a formula, your baby's probably not used to having a phenylalanine supplement in their formula, but they'll probably end up getting one if you go with a European brand. I don't think it'll make or break any of their health, but to be aware. And lastly, DHA and ARA. So a couple things. One, Europe, it's common to see different sources of DHA in Europe that we would like more of here. So almost every formula in the US has DHA and ARA added. Almost all of them use the hexane extracted sources. They do use hexane extracted sources in some European formulas too, but they also use some non-hexane extracted sources, like some fish oils that don't need to be hexane extracted. I want to make a point here that this is not an FDA issue. This is an industry issue. The FDA has approved several different sources of non-hexane extracted DHA and ARA for use in formula, including fish oil, tuna oil, and that egg phospholipid source that Babies Only uses. It's just that the companies in the US aren't choosing to use them. My guess is because it's much more expensive. So some companies in the EU are choosing some of these more expensive, but more parent-desired ingredients. So that's an issue we could solve in the US right away. If we have enough parent demand, companies will respond. So that's my public service announcement. Okay, and lastly, Europe recently passed some legislation that's going to require all stage 1 infant formulas, so that 0 to 6 month stage, to contain a source of DHA by 2020. So a lot of the formulas do not contain any, and it's going to be a requirement. And this is different than the US, which doesn't require any. It's really funny. The US doesn't require any DHA, but almost all formulas add it. And now we're seeing a change where the EU is going to require DHA, and most of the formulas there don't have it. And so I'm really nerdily excited to see how they choose to add it. If the companies that have to add it to their recipe, what sources they're going to use. So you're super excited about that too. I'll be sure to update you as soon as I notice any recipes changing. Like I said, they have until 2020 to adhere to these new guidelines. Okay. Those are all the big regulatory differences. There's lots of other little ones, but those are the big ones that I think parents should be aware of when choosing and thinking about a formula based on their individual baby's age. Next, this isn't as relevant to us because if you're watching this, you probably live in the US, but Europe and most of the rest of the world adheres to the WHO code of marketing for breast milk substitutes, which is formula, which is very strict and basically says you can't market formula because, as the human race, we should be supporting breastfeeding. Obviously, the US really loves our capitalism, and we said, no, that's not capitalistic, so we're not going to adhere to that. But imagine this. In Europe, there is no marketing of formula. No commercials, no billboards, no cute babies in baskets with bottles, no coupons, no sales, no samples given at the hospital. A formula company can't even give you a bottle or a pacifier or anything related to infant feeding or nipples of any kind. But just imagine that. The only place you could turn for advice about formula is your medical practitioner, and thus they'd probably want to know and give you some answers. So I think that is fantastic. It's also just less confusing. There's so many marketing messages in the US that are, I don't know if any of them do any good for parents, to be honest. So that's a really different cultural difference. Again, that doesn't matter for the ingredients at all, but that's a really big difference between the US and most of the world in general. Because that code is set by the World Health Organization, which, they're pretty nice there. And we're one of the only countries in the world that does not adhere. to go, America. Okay. My last 2 points I want to talk about are importing and suppliers, which are related. So though that's the biggest differences from like ingredients and regulation standpoint that you really should be aware of when considering a European formula. Next, if you decide with your doctor that in Australia we get ads for formula, you do? Well, Australia must not adhere to the WHO code. Thanks for that comment. I didn't know that. Because I think of Australia as being very breastfeeding friendly. You guys usually rock most of the research studies about that. You're far ahead of the US. So if you're in the US, or if you're in anywhere outside of Europe and you want a European formula, you will have to import it, obviously. So these are the things that I want you to be thinking of that are aside of ingredients, but basically how are you, if you've decided on a formula you love from Europe, how are you going to get it safely and feel good about feeding it to your baby from the supply side? So the first thing is, you got to do your research in terms of what formula you want. Now, if you go to my website, I've done all the breakdown of ingredients for you. So babyformulaexpert.com/European-formula. But it's really very difficult to find accurate information about ingredients online, especially if you're an ignorant or American like myself. And I only speak one language. So I don't speak German. And I can't read the Dutch label either. So it's just really hard to know what you're getting. And then the other thing is HIP, which is one of the major EU brands, manufactures formula in 3 different places. They have a German, a Dutch, and a UK version. And these versions are not all the same. For example, one, I think it's their stage 2. It's on the website, on my website. I break down the difference. Like one has a probiotic. One country's has a probiotic, one doesn't. And one country's is soy-free and one country's is not, even though they're both HIP stage 2. So if your baby has a soy sensitivity, that's a really big difference. So my point is to be sure you decide which formula you're getting. If you want HIP, be sure you know what country you're getting. And then if you're looking at a supplier, you better be dang sure your supplier can tell you which country, that they have very clear information about which country that formula is coming from. And they don't give you the spiel about they're all the same, or, I've heard a lot of stories about parents who have, they're getting it from one country and all of a sudden they place a refill order and they get it from a different country. So that's not okay in my mind. That's a change in formula. So that's a big thing that you need to consider. And then just importing in general, if you're in the US, you really need to check with your pediatrician, because a lot of pediatricians have their own opinions about European formula. A lot of them are just uncomfortable with it because it's an unknown to them, and they're in charge of keeping your baby healthy and safe. And so your relationship with your pediatrician is sacred, and you guys really need to be a team for your baby. So just be sure they're okay with it. You're welcome to send them to me now that I know all about the regulation differences. I feel like I could answer any of their questions, but it's important that they're on board. Okay, and now actual things that I like to look for in a supplier. Like I just said, accurate information, and I like it to have a list of ingredients on the website because that's one of the only places you can find English lists of ingredients. And to call out the country, like HIP, if it's a HIP formula, which individual manufacturing location it's coming from. And I want you to be able to specify. So I don't want you just to order HIP. Is it the HIP German, Dutch, or UK version, so that so that's specified in your order. It's important that your supplier have an established supply chain, because this is, we're talking about imports, exports. You don't want like a really small shop that has, their uncle lives in Austria, so they buy it at the store and send it to you. Like that can be shut down real quickly. So looking for a supplier that's a little more established, or at least, most of these suppliers are small, but they're happy to talk to you. Call and ask them about their supply chain, how long it's been running, how professional it is, that kind of a thing. Next, this is probably, I have two that this is probably the most important one. Air freight only. So obviously there's 2 ways to get formula from Europe to the US. You can fly it, or you can put it on a boat and send it across the ocean. I really only want you to buy from a supplier that uses air freight only. This obviously takes a shorter amount of time, so you're less likely to get a formula that's nearing its expiration date or even expired. And when you ship anything on an airplane, it goes in the underneath cabin, so it's really cold, and it's not, on a boat. It takes long times, and a lot of those shipping containers can be exposed to very high temperatures, very high humidity, which are both conditions that can accelerate the expiration process. So we're talking about babies, so it's best to be super safe and only deal with a supplier that only imports via air freight, never via shipping. And next, what I really like to see from suppliers is that they maintain a local inventory, so that when you place an order from a supplier, it's being shipped. It's obviously manufactured in Europe, but it's being shipped from the US. This is for two reasons. One, you get an accurate estimation of shipping. This is one of the biggest horror stories, is a parent places an order with a supplier, they think they're going to get it in 3 days. And then after 3 days later, when maybe they needed the formula exactly then, they get a notice saying, oh, it's delayed, it's on its way, it'll take 2 weeks. So you want to order from someone who keeps a US inventory. So the actual your can of formula is coming from a US location, not Europe. So the shipping estimation is accurate. The other reason for this is if it's shipping from their own local warehouse, their inventory online will be kept updated. I have never seen a European supplier that hasn't run out of something. I haven't found a single one, or I would be telling you who they were. However, if they're out of something, you want to know right away so that you don't order it and then a couple days later get a notice that it's back ordered. So if a company is shipping from a local warehouse, on their website, as soon as they're out of something, it immediately is listed as out of stock. So and you can go look for it somewhere else, as opposed to ordering it and finding out 3 days later and you've lost those 3 days. So those are the big things to look for in a supplier. I do have a supplier that I work with, at least in terms of clients that I work with. I like to use Baby Kind Market because they meet all of these. And I actually have an affiliate partnership with them. So if I send you there, if you buy something through a link that I give you, I get a little cut on the formula at no cost to you. But that's because I've been recommending them long before we had this partnership, and they approached me. And I will say, I will not name names, but I've been approached by several different European suppliers, and Baby Kind Market is the only one that sort of met all of my criteria and impressed me most on all the things that I was looking for. So I don't make recommendations lightly. But you're welcome to use any supplier you want. Those are my criteria that I look for in a supplier, so now you can vet them yourself. And like I said, I've spoken with a lot of these suppliers, and they're all the nicest people, and they're very happy to talk to you about their individual processes. So I really encourage you to call and chat with them. They're also nice and really care about babies' welfare, so I will say that about all of them. Okay. We made it, and the babies did not wake up. So in upcoming weeks, I will go through HIP, Hala, and Lebenswirt's main formulas and do a nutrition comparison. So now that was what you need to consider with European formulas overall, and I'll break down the individual companies in upcoming weeks. I do have a video doing this that's much older on YouTube, so I'm just going to do an updated version now that I can look at it having read the official regulatory documents myself. So if you're desperate, go back on YouTube or Facebook and search. If you can wait a week, I'll do it next week. I hope you guys all had a wonderful holiday. I hope you avoided the stomach bug. And I'm really excited to see everybody next week to keep talking European formula. In the meantime, if I can help you with your little one, I hope you didn't have formula tolerance issues over the holidays, but babies do not adhere to calendars, so I know it's inevitable. I do free consultations with families for 15 minutes to provide quick advice I can, and I'd be happy to talk to you. So you can sign up right by clicking, there's a link right on the Facebook page, or just go to babyformulaexpert.com, and there's a tab there that says work with Dr. Young, and you can get time on my calendar, and I'd love to chat. Okay, Happy New Year, everybody. I will see you next week. I can't wait. Bye.